What if Russia's most carefully prepared summer offensive did not collapse because Ukraine was stronger on paper, but because Moscow became dangerously overconfident in its own war machine? That is the question now hanging over the battlefield. Because from the outside, Russia entered this phase of the war with everything a major military power could possibly throw into the fight: elite formations, armored units, heavy artillery, airborne troops, naval infantry, assault battalions, and expendable shock troops pushed directly into the most dangerous parts of the front. On paper, it looked overwhelming. Inside Russian command rooms, the mood was likely confident, maybe even too confident. Maps were studied, axes of advance were marked, timelines were drawn. The objective seemed simple: break through Ukraine's southern defenses, lock down the eastern front, protect the land corridor to Crimea, and force the war back onto Moscow's terms before the summer was over. But war has a brutal way of exposing arrogance. And this time, according to public battlefield claims, Ukraine reclaimed 590 kilometers of territory, turning what Russia expected to be a decisive summer push into a strategic reversal that forced analysts around the world to reassess the entire direction of the war. Now, 590 kilometers may sound like just a number, but in war, land is never just land. Those 590 kilometers represent abandoned trenches. They represent collapsed supply routes. They represent destroyed ammunition hubs, disrupted command nodes, and fortified positions that Russian commanders had spent months describing as nearly impossible to breach. This was not empty countryside. These were prepared defensive zones. These were trench networks, logistics corps, artillery support areas, drone bases, and command posts. Russia had poured money, manpower, and military pride into holding them. And then Ukraine began taking them apart. What makes this even more significant is how Ukraine did it. This was not a return to the old style of warfare, where massive armored columns charge across open fields and hope to smash through by sheer force. Ukraine had already learned that lesson the hard way. The 2023 counteroffensive showed the world how devastating it could be to send armor into minefields under Russian artillery, helicopter fire, and drone surveillance. Those lessons were not ignored, they were absorbed. By 2026, Ukraine had shifted into a different kind of battlefield doctrine. It was no longer trying to punch through the wall with brute force. It was looking for cracks. It was slipping through them quietly. It was cutting the nerves of the Russian defense system before sending infantry forward. This was no longer simply a war of mass. It had become a war of precision. The center of this entire story is Zaporizhzhia. This is not just another front line. It is one of the most strategically important sectors of the war. Whoever controls momentum here can threaten Russia's land corridor to Crimea. Whoever pushes deep enough here can place Russian forces in the south under extreme pressure. Whoever brings artillery and rocket systems close enough to the Tokmak-Melitopol route can begin choking the logistical bloodstream of Russia's southern military presence. Moscow understands that. Kyiv understands it too. That is why Russia deployed serious power into the area. The 58th Combined Arms Army was repositioned into the Zaporizhzhia region. The 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, equipped with heavy Soviet-era armor and weapons, was also involved. Russia's VDV airborne troops, long promoted as an elite force, were placed on standby. The 810th Naval Infantry Brigade was redeployed from Crimea toward the front, and then there were the Storm Z penal battalions, shock troops often pushed into the most dangerous forward positions to absorb fire, probe defenses, and expose Ukrainian firing points. If you only looked at the order of battle, Russia seemed ready for something big. But the problem for Russia was simple. It had prepared for one kind of war, while Ukraine had learned to fight another. The first major blow came between May 17 and May 20, 2026, along the Molotov-Machka and Bohivka axis. This area mattered because of its terrain. The high ground there helped shield Russia's southern supply corridor. Losing it meant losing the natural cover that protected one of the most important logistical routes in the region. Ukraine's 118th Mechanized Brigade led the assault. But this was not a noisy frontal charge. Ukrainian troops moved at night. They used darkness as cover. They broke into smaller units. They advanced carefully, quietly, and with a level of discipline that showed how much Ukrainian tactics had evolved. Facing them were heavy Russian elements tied to the 58th Combined Arms Army, forces that had been waiting and preparing for months. But when the Ukrainian attack began, Russia immediately ran into a fatal problem. The low sky above the battlefield no longer belonged to Russia. Hundreds of Ukrainian FPV drones appeared over the battlefield like a coordinated swarm. These drones had not arrived blindly. For weeks they had been mapping Russian positions. Every trench line, bunker, ammunition point, vehicle hideout, communications node, and exposed movement route. When the assault began, that intelligence was instantly converted into battlefield effect. At the same time, Ukrainian electronic warfare systems targeted Russian communications. Russian soldiers inside the trenches suddenly lost contact with their commanders. They could not receive clear orders. They could not coordinate with neighboring units. They could not understand where the main attack was coming from or how broad it was. The fortifications that were supposed to protect them began to feel like traps. Then came the artillery. Western-supplied precision systems began striking bunkers and defensive points marked by Ukrainian drones. This was not random shelling. It was targeted fire. Every bunker that had been identified became a target. Every ammunition storage point became vulnerable. Every command node became a liability. Once the artillery paused, Ukrainian infantry moved quickly through the gaps. They advanced in small mobile squads instead of large formations. They used drone feeds in real time. They moved around minefields and anti-tank obstacles through routes that had already been studied and prepared. The Russian 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, along with elements of the 71st and 291st Regiments, could not hold. They abandoned positions and fell back. By May 20, Molotov and Bohivka were under Ukrainian control. On a map, this looked like a tactical gain. But strategically, it was much more than that. This breakthrough opened a path toward Tokmak, one of the most important logistics hubs in southern Ukraine. Tokmak is not just a city, it is a connector. It links ammunition, fuel, supplies, and movement routes that support Russia's southern defensive system. Once Ukrainian forces and artillery move close enough to threaten Tokmak, every Russian unit farther south has to start asking a terrifying question: how long will the supplies keep coming? That is the real genius of this Ukrainian approach. Ukraine does not need to destroy an entire Russian army in one dramatic battle. It only needs to make that army unable to eat, shoot, move, communicate, and resupply consistently. When that happens, even the strongest defensive line begins to rot from the inside. And Ukraine did not stop at Molotov. Between May 20 and May 23, Ukrainian forces expanded their offensive farther west. The next target was Zalizny, a village positioned within Russia's western defensive network. This was not a random village, it was a structural node. Trenches extended outward from it, making it part of the architecture that held the local Russian defense together. If Zalizny fell, the surrounding defensive web would begin to lose cohesion. Once again, Ukraine's 118th Mechanized Brigade was involved, this time supported by the 65th Mechanized Brigade on the flank. And again, Ukraine did not send armor blindly into minefields. It sent drones first. At night, FPV drones hunted Russian logistics. They targeted ammunition trucks, supply vehicles, and convoys moving behind the front line. One by one, supply routes were disrupted. The flow of ammunition from Russian rear areas to forward trenches slowed, then began to break down. And once ammunition stops arriving, a fortified position becomes a cage. Russian soldiers around Zalizny began running low on supplies. Ukraine then used artillery to soften the defenses before launching a fast infantry raid into the northern part of the village. Drones watched every Russian movement in real time. Any attempt to shift forces was detected. Any defensive position that revealed itself was marked. The village fell. Then Ridkadov, just northwest of Zalizny, also came under Ukrainian control. This mattered because it confirmed something larger than a local success. Ukraine had fully moved from defense to offense in this sector. Russia was no longer setting the pace. Russia was reacting. Russia was scrambling. Russia was trying to plug holes in a defensive system that had already started to fracture. And for any army, losing the initiative is dangerous. Because once you lose the initiative, you are no longer fighting your own plan. You are fighting the enemy's plan. The same pattern appeared in Donetsk. Russian forces had been pushing hard toward Pokrovsk, trying to maintain momentum in the east. But during May, Ukraine launched a series of local counterattacks near Kostiantynivka and Druzhkivka that stopped Russia's advance cold. The 47th Mechanized Brigade and elite unmanned systems units began operating deep behind Russian lines. They struck ammunition depots, fuel storage sites, supply convoys, and railway infrastructure. This is the kind of war that often does not produce dramatic video footage. There are no giant tank columns charging across open ground. There are no cinematic mass assaults. Instead, there is a drone flying 40 kilometers behind the front line at 2 in the morning, spotting a fuel tanker on a dark road, and destroying it before the driver even realizes he is being watched. One strike like that may look small. But hundreds of strikes like that, repeated across hundreds of kilometers, can turn an entire logistics network into a burning chain of broken links. Without fuel, tanks do not move. Without ammunition, artillery falls silent. Without communications, commanders lose control. Without reconnaissance drones, Russian guns become less accurate. And when all of those problems happen together, a large military begins to lose its ability to function as one coordinated body. One of the most important Ukrainian strikes took place in the Kherson region, on the eastern bank of the Dnipro River, in Russian-occupied territory. Russia had established a drone command center near Oleshki. This facility served as the eyes and ears of Russian forces in the area. Reconnaissance drones launched from this base provided targeting coordinates to Russian artillery, which then fired on Ukrainian positions across the river. In other words, this was a key link in Russia's strike chain. On May 23, 2026, Ukrainian UAV units launched a precisely timed attack. A swarm of next-generation FPV kamikaze drones approached the facility just as Russian drone operators were gathered nearby. The drones hit in consecutive waves. The building caught fire. 15 experienced Russian drone operators were killed inside. The facility was destroyed. This was not just a casualty event, it was a capability loss. A trained drone operator cannot be replaced overnight. A functioning reconnaissance network cannot be restored simply by pushing more infantry to the front. And when Russian military bloggers publicly mourned the loss, they effectively confirmed that the damage was too serious to hide. Ukraine had blinded part of Russia's battlefield network. From Zaporizhia to Donetsk, from rear supply roads to the eastern bank of the Dnipro, the same Ukrainian method kept appearing. Ukraine was not attacking Russia where Russia was strongest. It was attacking where Russia was most dependent. It did not smash directly into the steel wall. It cut the wires, disrupted the fuel, jammed the radios, destroyed the eyes, and then let the steel wall become slow, heavy, and confused. That is why the Tokmak-Melitopol route is now so important. This route functions like the central nervous system of Russia's southern military presence. It keeps Russian forces in occupied southern Ukraine supplied and connected to Crimea. Every kilometer Ukraine advances in Zaporizhia brings Ukrainian artillery and rocket systems closer to this vital corridor. Once that corridor comes under sustained and accurate fire, Russia's entire southern front faces the risk of slow strangulation. More than 40,000 Russian troops are reportedly stationed in Crimea. Those forces depend on overland routes for fuel, ammunition, food, equipment, and medical supplies. If Ukraine can put those routes under constant pressure, it does not have to defeat all of those troops in a direct battle. It can isolate them. It can cut them off. It can force them to live on whatever is already stored in warehouses. In modern war, that is not a minor problem. That is a slow-motion disaster. Russian military planners know this, and because they know it, they are now trapped in a dilemma with no clean solution. If Russia pulls troops from Donetsk to reinforce Zaporizhia, the eastern offensive slows down. If Russia pulls reserves from Crimea or Kherson to plug gaps in the south, Ukraine may find opportunities across the Dnipro. If Russia keeps forces where they are, the weaknesses already exposed by Ukraine may widen even further. Every option creates a new vulnerability somewhere else. That is what strategists call a strategic dilemma. And Ukraine did not create it by accident. It created it deliberately by applying pressure across multiple fronts at the same time. Pressure in Zaporizhia, counterattacks in Donetsk, drone strikes in Kherson, logistics hunting behind Russian lines, electronic warfare at the front, precision artillery against command and supply nodes. The result is that Russia cannot concentrate its strength in one place. It is being stretched. It is being forced to react. It is being pushed into a constant state of emergency repair. This is where the difference in adaptation becomes impossible to ignore. Russia entered the summer believing that numbers, firepower, and fortifications would allow it to regain the initiative. Ukraine entered the summer with a different formula: smaller units, faster movement, sharper intelligence, drone dominance, electronic warfare, and precision fire. One side brought the weight of an old military tradition. The other side brought the logic of a new battlefield. The image of huge armored columns rolling across open fields is increasingly becoming a relic of the past. The new reality is small teams moving at night, guided by real-time drone feeds covered by precision artillery, and preceded by swarms of unmanned weapons that do not feel fear. For Russia, this creates not only a tactical problem, but a psychological one. A trench can be reinforced with concrete, a bunker can be dug deep, a minefield can be laid across miles of open ground. But if the soldiers inside those positions believe every movement is being watched by drones, every supply truck can be destroyed on the road, and every radio signal can be jammed, then the defensive line starts weakening before the main attack even arrives. Modern warfare does not only destroy equipment, it destroys the feeling of safety. That is what Ukraine has been doing effectively. It is making Russian soldiers doubt their fortifications. It is making Russian commanders doubt their rear areas. It is making Russian logistics units afraid to move openly. It is making places that once felt like safe staging zones suddenly feel exposed. That is why the reclaimed 590 kilometers are more than a territorial gain. They are evidence that battlefield initiative has shifted. Russia believed it was preparing for a summer of domination. Instead, it faced disruption. Russia expected to force Ukraine into reaction mode. Instead, Russia became the side reacting. Russia tried to use mass to break the front. Ukraine used precision to break the system behind the front. Of course, this does not mean the war is over. It does not mean Russia is collapsing overnight. Russia remains a dangerous military power with large manpower reserves, heavy weapons, deep stockpiles, and a high tolerance for losses. But what has changed is the strategic narrative. Russia can no longer easily claim that it controls the momentum. Ukraine has challenged that claim on the ground through recaptured territory, disrupted logistics, destroyed drone facilities, abandoned Russian positions, and pressure on key supply corridors. To understand the real meaning of 590 kilometers, do not look only at the size of the territory. Look at what comes with it. A defensive belt has been opened. A logistics corridor has been threatened. Crimea's connection to the southern front is under greater pressure. Russian command systems have been disrupted. Russian forces have been stretched across too many directions. And most importantly, an older style of war is being challenged by a newer one. Putin may have entered the summer expecting Russia's scale to impose the outcome, but Ukraine has shown that scale alone is not enough if the system connecting that scale begins to fail. A large army can become slow, a long defensive line can become a burden, a vital supply corridor can become a critical weakness. That is why this campaign matters. Not because of one battle, not because of one village, not because of one dramatic moment. It matters because it shows Ukraine learning, adapting, and using Russia's own bulk against it. Every destroyed supply truck makes the next defensive position harder to hold. Every ammunition depot hit makes the next counterattack weaker. Every drone station destroyed makes Russian artillery less effective. Every village lost forces Russia to spend more soldiers, more shells, more fuel, and more time rebuilding what it had previously considered secure. In a war of attrition, small repeated losses become major strategic pressure. So when we look at the larger picture, Russia's summer offensive did not just suffer a local setback. It revealed a deeper weakness. Russia prepared for dominance, but Ukraine delivered systematic disruption. Russia trusted mass, but Ukraine attacked connectivity. Russia built walls, but Ukraine cut foundations. Russia gathered force, but Ukraine forced that force to spread thin. The 590 kilometers are not the final chapter of this war, but they are an important chapter. They show that this summer is not unfolding according to Moscow's preferred script. They show that Ukraine still has the ability to surprise, to counterattack, and most importantly, to turn technology into concrete battlefield gains. The war is not over. The front remains long. Losses will continue. The outcome is still being written. But if there is one message from this phase of the fighting, it is this. The battlefield no longer belongs automatically to the side with more tanks, more artillery, or more troops. It belongs to the side that sees first, strikes more precisely, adapts faster, and forces the enemy into worse choices. And in this phase, Ukraine has done exactly that. If you follow this war not just to watch the map change, but to understand why the map changes, then this is the point to remember. 590 kilometers were not reclaimed by accident. They were the result of a layered campaign involving reconnaissance drones, electronic warfare, precision artillery, logistic strikes, command disruption, and fast-moving infantry. Russia entered the summer hoping to end the game on its own terms. But on the very trench lines it once believed were nearly untouchable, Ukraine proved that overconfidence can become one of the most dangerous weaknesses any army can have. And if this pattern continues, the biggest question may no longer be how much territory Ukraine can reclaim. The bigger question may be this. How much territory can Russia still hold when Ukraine is no longer simply fighting Russian soldiers, but dismantling the entire system that keeps them in the fight?